So this week, we're going to look at single subject design. You know that as classroom teachers, you are also researchers. Every day you hypothesize, intervene, take data, analyze the results of your intervention, and evaluate what has happened. Based on that, you make data-based decisions. However, when our numbers are small, like in our classrooms, we might only be working with one student, a small group of students, or even a whole class is still a relatively small number. We still have to make sure that what we think is changing, improving, or making behavior worse is what is actually changing behavior. So that's why we use single subject research designs in implementing our intervention and then evaluating our results. By doing this, we can make sure that there's a functional relation between what we see happening and our intervention. We do this for both social and academic behaviors. The ability to conduct classroom-based research in your classroom will increase your effectiveness as a teacher and your credibility. So in this particular lesson, this week, we're focusing on being able to identify the components of an experiment that are required to establish a functional relation. We're going to focus on identifying the components of different types of single subject research designs and some advantages and disadvantages of each. We're going to explain how to implement each of the different types of single subject research designs and how we might display those in graphs and evaluating those outcomes. We'll also look at the components of action research and how it parallels what we do when we're using single subject research designs. To start, we want to define some terms. Now let's start with our three terms: dependent and independent variable and functional relation. The dependent variable, this is the behavior that's targeted for change, whatever the student is doing that we want to improve, to increase, to decrease, whatever. The second is the independent variable. This is the intervention that we as the teacher are using in order to change the behavior. And that could be praise, or it could be a teaching strategy, it could be anything, but it's the independent variable. It's what we are controlling. Then there's functional relation. A functional relation is demonstrated if the changes in the dependent variable are replicated or duplicated each time the independent variable is implemented. So we can only say for certain that my intervention is making the change in behavior if it's replicated each time. Now, there are rules for doing this, and one of the reasons that we do it is so that we can rule out the presence of any confounding variables, like something else that's interfering with the reason that our behavior intervention is or isn't working. And functional relation is the focus of our single subject design research. So let's try an example. Following a student's oral reading, the teacher provided corrective feedback. The dependent variable, the behavior that's targeted for change, is the student's oral reading. And the independent variable, this is the intervention, is the feedback that the teacher is providing. Let's try a few more for practice. Let's say our goal is to increase compliance in a vocational setting by implementing a token reinforcement system. So which one is the dependent variable? And the independent variable? Let's try another one. Use picture prompts with students with severe disabilities to increase instruction following skills. The dependent variable is, and the independent variable? I'll put a link to a few more practice ones in the calendar. Now, there are a couple of basic categories of designs. We have group designs versus single subject designs. With group designs, we are evaluating the effects of an intervention on a population or a sample of a population. And typically, we'll have a control group and an experimental group, and we'll compare those two. We used statistical analyses to verify the differences in changes in average scores between the groups. We want to verify that change is significant, and then we want to verify that the change is due to the intervention and not just a chance. With single subject designs, we're evaluating the effects of the intervention on a specific behavior of an individual. This requires repeated measures of the behavior. That's the dependent variable. We also look at individuals compared to the self rather than others, and our emphasis with single subject is on clinical rather than statistical significance. There are some common components. One, we start with a baseline. 2, there's at least one measure of performance under intervention, and then there's at least one replication of intervention within the design. We start with baseline measures. This is the first phase of any single subject research design. We collect that baseline data, and that gives us a measure of the level of behavior, which is the dependent variable, as it occurs before any intervention happens. We do this because it serves two functions. One, a descriptive function. It describes the current performance. And then 2, a predictive function. This provides an estimate of performance if an intervention is not conducted. Now, stability. We talked about baseline stability a couple of weeks ago, but this is required to meet both functions. What we do is check for variability of the data points and trends in the data points. The formula for calculating the baseline is going to be as follows. First, you find the mean of your data. To do this, you add up all of the values and then divide that by the number of data points. Next, you calculate 50% of the mean. To do this, you take the mean and divide it by 2. Then, you add the number that represents 50% of the mean to the mean, and then subtract the number that represents 50% of the mean from the mean. And now you have determined the range where all of your data points should fall in order to determine the stability. Now on the calendar, I've linked for you a video showing you exactly how to do that and giving you some examples of it. It takes about 3 minutes to watch, so check that out if you need more practice with it. Next, we want to look at trends. Trends are an indication of a distinctive direction in the performance of behaviors. So if we've got data points that are going in the same direction, that's what we're looking for, 3 data points in the same direction. Now, in terms of requirements for a functional relation, first of all, we start with a prediction, or a statement that a particular independent variable will alter the dependent variable. Our next step is to verify the prediction, the increase or the decrease in the dependent variable during the first intervention phase. Then we're looking at the approximate return to baseline levels of performance when the intervention is withdrawn. Then we go to a replication of that effect. We reintroduce the independent variable, resulting again in the same desired change in behavior. That behavior change that happens with the intervention, the behavior going back to baseline without the intervention, and then the behavior changing once more with the intervention being reintroduced, is that replication phase. Now, we can still look at multiple kinds of single subject design within that. So we start with an A-B design. This is honestly what most teachers do on a daily basis. They evaluate the effects of an independent variable on a dependent variable. They start with the baseline, which is phase A, and that's when nothing is happening from an intervention standpoint, and then they begin an intervention, that's phase B, and then they start taking data on it to see, does the student's behavior improve when I do this? The advantage is it's super easy to do this in a classroom setting, but the disadvantage is without a replication, we cannot demonstrate a functional relation. It's a weak verification because there's no return to baseline. So I can do an intervention and the behavior might improve, but I can't say for certain that it was because of my intervention. It could have been from any number of other variables that I'm not really aware of or that I can't count. The next one is called a reversal design, and that's really what I had described earlier. This design includes an evaluation of a single independent variable on a single dependent variable with sequential application of a withdrawal and an intervention. So we start with baseline 1 and 2, that's phase A, and then we have intervention 1 and 2, that's phase B. So baseline, do the intervention, withdraw the intervention, and put the intervention in again. The advantage of a reversal design is that you can establish a functional relation. You can say with a high degree of certainty, I know this worked because I have this reversal happening. The behavior changed and it followed the pattern. The disadvantage is it might be inappropriate to return to baseline if it would pose a danger to other students. So if you have a student who engages in, say, aggressive behavior, you're not going to withdraw the intervention if you think that it's working, because that wouldn't be appropriate. Or if the inappropriate behavior is not reversible. So that's also a time when it wouldn't be used. The next is called changing criterion design. Now, this design includes evaluating the effectiveness of an independent variable by demonstrating that a variable, a dependent variable, can be increased or decreased little by little toward a terminal performance goal. So the baseline is phase A, the intervention is phase B, and then the intervention phase is going to be divided into subphases, each requiring a closer approximation to the terminal behavior, the end goal behavior. With this, the behavior has to meet criteria in 3 consecutive phases in order for us to say, this has a functional relation. This intervention has a functional relation on this behavior. Now, the advantage of this is it's useful when a terminal goal is distant from baseline performance. It can be well suited for measuring the effectiveness of a shaping procedure, so if we're trying to shape some behavior, and it's useful when behaviors are measured in terms of frequency, duration, latency, or force. And you also don't have to withdraw the intervention in order to keep doing this one. The disadvantage is that it's inappropriate when the behavior must occur immediately, and it might not be appropriate to hold back the student. When we are determining the criteria for changing criteria in design, we are setting and decreasing by an amount that's equal to the mean of the stable portion of the baseline. So we set as half the mean of the baseline, then we select the highest or lowest level of baseline performance, and then we do a professional estimate of the student's ability. It allows us to increase the credibility. We continue through subphases until stability and varying number of sessions is required. With this, we want to vary the criteria for the increase or the decrease or change in the opposite direction. Multiple baseline. This is one that we use pretty frequently, and if you start reading some of the articles that are in our calendar, you'll see this a lot. This design includes evaluating the effectiveness of an independent variable on 2 or more behaviors with 1 student in a single setting, so this is across behaviors, or 2 or more students who exhibit the same behavior in a single setting, so then it's across students, or 2 or more settings in which 1 student is exhibiting the behavior, and that would be across settings. So we have a baseline, which is phase A, and this gets repeated across behaviors, students, and settings. And then we have the intervention, which is phase B, and then that gets repeated across behaviors, students, and settings. Now, the advantage of this is we can demonstrate a functional relation. We can use it in situations in which a withdrawal of the intervention is unethical. So if we have a student who is learning some safety behavior where it's not ethical to withdraw the behavior, so we can use this across settings to demonstrate that functional relation. We can also use it when there are multiple behaviors, multiple settings, or multiple individuals who need this one intervention. And it can be used when the effects of the independent variable cannot be withdrawn or reversed. The disadvantage is it can't be used when the target behaviors are not functionally similar or independent of one another. It's also not useful when there's more than one intervention phase. It's not useful when more than one intervention phase is desirable in order to demonstrate a functional relation. And it's difficult to use when constraints on resources make implementation impossible. Extensive baselines might also be inappropriate, and if that's the case, we want to consider using multiple probe design. We can also use alternating treatment design, and this is also another common one. We might see this called ABAB. And this is when we evaluate the effectiveness of multiple independent variables on a single dependent variable. So I have one behavior that I'm trying to change, but I have 3 different interventions or 2 different interventions that I'm trying to use. We start with the baseline phase, and then we have 2 or more intervention phases. The intervention phases are alternated. We can do a random rotation or a counterbalancing that needs to control for any carryover or sequencing effects. Sometimes people will call this the multi-element design, but most of the time people will call it alternating treatment. The advantage is it's very useful in determining the effectiveness of more than one intervention on a given behavior. It allows us to compare between interventions, and that way it's a little bit more efficient in terms of our data collection, and we can use it when the baseline data are not available or if the baseline data isn't stable. It's also pretty simple to determine a functional relation because we can look for fractionated intervention data paths. The disadvantage of this is that it's not particularly useful if the treatments might interact, so that's going to mess up the results. It's also difficult if the student can't discriminate between the different treatment conditions, and it's not ideal when the treatments are producing slow behavior changes. We also don't recommend it when the treatments need to be administered over a continuous period of time in order to be effective. And finally, we have multiple treatment design. In multiple treatment design, we are looking at evaluating the effectiveness of multiple independent variables on a single dependent variable. We have a baseline, which is phase A, and then we have 2 or more intervention phases, B and C, and it could be even DE. And then the intervention phases are alternated sequentially. So it might be ABC, ABC, it could be AB, AC, it could be ABC, AB. It's all just going to depend on how you're doing it. The advantage is you can determine the relative effectiveness of more than one intervention on a given behavior, similar to the alternating treatment. You can build an instructional package or fade different components as needed. The disadvantage is it doesn't always demonstrate a functional relation. So you have to have a replication of baseline and effective intervention phase in order to do that. When we are looking at the analysis of the results, we've got experimental, clinical, and social things to consider. With experimental criterion, we're trying to verify an independent variable was responsible for the change in the dependent variable. So we want to prove our intervention changed the behavior. That's the experimental criterion. The clinical criterion is a judgment as to whether or not the results of the intervention will have a large enough impact on the people who receive the intervention. And then we've got social validity. This is the social acceptability of procedures and results. And we have to consider the student's preference for the intervention with this. The students are our partners in this process. When we're doing this analysis, we also look at visual analysis, and this is why we practice our graphing in the behavior change project. So we look at the visual analysis of the graph. We can evaluate the change in means across phases. We can evaluate the level of performance. We can look at the magnitude and the direction of the change. We can also evaluate the trend in performance. We're looking for systematic and consistent change. It also allows us for us to look at, we want to look at the percentage of overlap of data that's plotted for performance across continuous conditions, like looking at effect size. And then we can also look at rapidly changing behavior, so latency to the behavior change and things like that. In your text, there are some specific instructions for how to compute lines of progress in terms of actually drawing this on the graph. And I'm going to have you look to that and practice that, and we'll do some more of it in class. I'm not going to talk about it here because it's just a process that you can follow. But some things to consider regarding our visual analysis. Some advantages: it is quick, effective, and it's relatively easy to learn. As a teacher, you are empowered to make ongoing database decisions that are related to your instructional choices and behavior management as your data are collected, and it favors strong behavior change. The disadvantage is that with a visual analysis, there can be a lack of the concrete rules needed. It's open to inconsistent interpretation, and it's not always sensitive to subtle changes in behavior. Now, this is where our action research comes into place. Action research is a systematic inquiry to gather information and reflect on how the school operates, how I teach, how well my students learn, and it's a really naturalistic form of research. It's not intended to demonstrate functional relations. So if we're using that A-B design here as part of our action research, that's okay. It's relatively non-experimental. We have descriptive aims, and it draws on research design tools. So it mirrors a lot of our single subject design research. With this, I encourage you all to be thinking about your placements in your classrooms as places where you can conduct action research. You want to start by identifying an area of focus or concern, start collecting data for documentation, analyze and interpret that data, and then go through the process of sharing information with others and developing an action plan. So more stuff for you on the calendar in terms of practice, and I will see you next week.